Hello, welcome to video lecture number 72. Today we are talking about conflicted legacies of World War I. Our subsections today are racial strife, erosion of labor rights, and finally the Red Scare. So the First World War was a catastrophe. While the Allied powers, including the United States, were victorious on the battlefield, peace afterward proved elusive. Indeed, the United States ultimately rejected the treaty ending the war. At the same time, the nation's adjustment to post-war life was difficult. Nativism and racism flourished, and wartime repression of dissent carried over into the post-war Red Scare as the Bolsheviks in Russia fought a civil war to gain control of that country. Russian communists also called for the overthrow of capitalist governments everywhere, including the United States. The Red Army's successes abroad and the Red Scare at home provided the backdrop for bitter labor management strife during the shift from a wartime economy to a peacetime economy. Meanwhile, the nationwide enforcement of prohibition, now part of the Constitution, the 18th Amendment, which was ratified in 1919 and went into effect 1 year later, publicly and deeply divided dry supporters and wet opponents. Moreover, growing differences between modernists and fundamentalists within Protestant denominations spilled over into politics, as a few states, most famously Tennessee, legislated against teaching Charles Darwin's theory of evolution in the public schools. Opponents of evolution, who were cruelly portrayed by H.L. Mencken and others as ignoramuses, believed the theory devalued human life. But by 1925, the year a biology teacher was put on trial in Tennessee for teaching evolution, research in the new field of genetics had revolutionized the theory of evolution. Darwin's revised theory became, and remains, the foundation for the study of the life sciences. Until the 1920s, the great advances in the understanding of nature, Copernicus's heliocentric theory, Newton's laws of motion, Darwin's theory of natural selection, were made by Europeans. After the First World War, America would begin to emerge as a scientific leader in its own right, although it would still be another generation before the United States would become the scientific giant that it is today. In the years between 1924 and 1929, Edwin P. Hubble, an American astronomer at the Mount Wilson Observatory in Southern California, made a series of discoveries using what was, at the time, the largest and most powerful telescope in the world. Hubble's observations would profoundly change the understanding of the universe. All right, so let's continue then with conflicted legacies of World War I, starting with our very first subsection, racial strife. Many African Americans emerged from the war determined to stand up for their rights and contributed to a spirit of resistance to oppression that characterized the early 1920s. Blacks who had migrated to the North and blacks who had served in the war had high expectations that exacerbated white racism. Lynching nearly doubled in the South, and race riots broke out in the North. A variety of tensions were present in these northern cities where the violence erupted. Black voters determined the winners of close elections, and blacks competed with whites for jobs and housing. Okay, our next subsection is the erosion of labor rights. The war effort, overseen by a Democratic administration sympathetic to labor, had temporarily increased the size and power of labor unions. The National War Labor Board, the NWLB, formed in April 1918, established an 8-hour workday for war workers, with time-and-a-half pay for overtime, and it endorsed equal pay for women. In return for a no-strike pledge, the NWLB also supported workers' rights to organize. Membership in the AFL, the American Federation of Labor that we talked about before, grew by a third, reaching over 3 million by war's end. Workers' expectations rose as the war economy brought higher pay and better working conditions. Workers of all races had hoped for a better life then. But after the war, employers resumed attacks on union activity, and rapidly rising inflation threatened to wipe out wage increases. As a result of workers' determination and employers' resistance, 1 in every 5 workers went on strike in 1919. Strikes were held by steel workers, shipyard workers in Seattle, and policemen in Boston. At the time, Governor Calvin Coolidge of Massachusetts fired the entire Boston police force, and that strike failed. Coolidge was rewarded with the Republican vice presidential nomination in 1920. Now, a crucial factor in organized labor's failure to win many of its strikes in the post-war period was the pervasive fear of radicalism in America, which coincided with a long-standing anxiety about unassimilated immigrants, an anxiety that had been made worse by the war. Anti-labor decisions by the Supreme Court were an important factor in labor's decline. In Colorado Coal Company versus United Mine Workers in 1925, the court ruled that a striking union could be penalized for illegal restraint of trade. The court also struck down federal legislation regulating child labor. In Atkins versus Children's Hospital, 1923, it voided a minimum wage for women workers in the District of Columbia, reversing many of the gains that had been achieved before World War I through the groundbreaking decision in Muller versus Oregon. Now, such decisions and aggressive anti-union campaigns caused membership in labor unions to fall from 5.1 million in 1920 to 3.6 million in 1929, only 10% of the non-agricultural workforce. The 1920s marked the heyday also of welfare capitalism, a system of labor relations that stressed management's responsibility for employees' well-being. Employers hoped this idea would build a loyal workforce and head off strikes and labor unrest. At a time when government unemployment compensation and Social Security did not exist, General Electric, U.S. Steel, and other large corporations offered workers health insurance and old age pensions. But such plans only covered about 5% of the industrial workforce. Okay, on to the last section, the Red Scare. The Russian Revolution of 1917 so alarmed the Allies that Wilson sent several thousand troops to Russia in hopes of weakening the Bolshevik regime. American fears of communism deepened as the labor unrest coincided with the founding of the Bolsheviks' Third International, or Comintern, to export communist doctrine and revolution to the rest of the world. Ironically, as public concern about domestic Bolshevism increased, the U.S. Communist Party and the Communist Labor Party were rapidly losing members and political power. Tensions mounted with a series of bombings then in the early spring of 1919. In November, Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer staged the first of what were known as Palmer raids, in which federal agents stormed the headquarters of radical organizations. Lacking the protection of U.S. citizenship, thousands of aliens who had previously committed absolutely no crime, but were suspect because of their anarchistic or revolutionary beliefs or their immigrant backgrounds, faced deportation without formal trial or indictment. Palmer predicted that a conspiracy attempt to overthrow the government would occur on May Day in 1920. When the incident never occurred, the hysteria of the Red Scare began to abate. Now, at the height of the Red Scare, Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, alien draft evaders, were arrested for robbery and murder, were denied a new trial even though evidence surfaced that suggested their innocence, and were executed in 1927. And that is an example of the kind of fear that was pervasive throughout the country at this time. Fear of the unknown, fear of radicalism, Again, fear of unassimilated immigrants, and that is an example of what happened to these people. Okay, so this does conclude our video lecture for today. Go ahead and answer those review questions and continue on with your work.